My name is Peggy and I am 35 years old, but nothing in my life could have prepared me for what I saw that night. My parents, both in their 70s, stood shivering outside my front door, lips blue from the cold, while inside my in-laws hosted an elegant dinner party filled with strangers. My father clutched his chest, his recent heart surgery scar hidden beneath layers of clothing that were no match for the freezing temperature. My mother could barely stand, her arthritis worsened by the chill in the air. What happened next changed everything. Growing up, my parents had given me everything they possibly could despite our modest means. My father worked 2 jobs for 20 years, his hands rough from labor, but gentle when they held mine. My mother stretched every dollar until it seemed to multiply, making miracles happen at our dinner table, so I never felt the pinch of our limitations. When I was accepted into college with a partial scholarship, they emptied their savings account without hesitation. During those years, they never once complained about their sacrifices. My father's heart problems worsened in his 60s, culminating in a triple bypass just months ago. His recovery was steady but fragile, requiring medication and careful monitoring. My mother's rheumatoid arthritis had advanced to the point where even simple tasks were difficult, but despite these challenges, they insisted on maintaining their independence, living in the same modest home where I grew up. Our traditions remained strong. I called them every day, and Sunday dinners were sacred. They beamed with pride at my achievements, framing my first business card on their refrigerator, crying with joy at my first promotion. 7 years ago, I met Robert at an industry conference. He worked for a competing agency, but completely charmed me during a panel discussion we both spoke on. Confident, ambitious, driven, we connected instantly. Coffee turned into dinner, dinner into a whirlwind romance, and within a year we were married in a ceremony that, looking back, contained warning signs I ignored. At first our marriage seemed idyllic. We supported each other's careers, celebrated milestones, and bought a small condo we painted and furnished together. Robert made Sunday breakfast before we visited my parents, even bringing my father his favorite coffee, or helping my mother with household repairs. But slowly, cracks began to show. Robert always took his parents' calls no matter what we were doing, their opinions outweighing anyone's, including mine. His parents, Nancy and Walter, should have raised red flags from the beginning. At our engagement party, they arrived in matching designer outfits and surveyed my parents' modest home with thinly veiled disdain. Nancy remarked on how charming it was to see simple living, while Walter scoffed at my father's pension plan. During wedding planning, they insisted on controlling everything from flowers to food, telling me I'd embarrass Robert if I handled it myself. Robert minimized their behavior, assuring me they only wanted the best for us, so I convinced myself they would warm up eventually. Years later, my career began outpacing Robert's. When I landed a major pharmaceutical client and earned a huge promotion and bonus, Robert congratulated me, but behind his smile was envy. I suggested using my bonus as a down payment for a house, and while he seemed enthusiastic, his parents immediately inserted themselves into the process. Walter brought printouts of neighborhoods far beyond our budget, and Nancy patted my hand, saying I thought small because of my upbringing. Despite their interference, we found a beautiful home. 3 bedrooms, a home office, and most importantly, a ground-floor guest suite I envisioned for my parents as they aged. I contributed 70% of the down payment, something Robert asked me not to mention to his parents. When they first visited, Nancy brought a decorator who scrutinized every room, assuring Robert she'd fix the flaws. For our housewarming party, I carefully planned an intimate gathering that considered my father's dietary restrictions and my mother's need to elevate her legs. 3 days before the event, Robert casually mentioned his mother had invited a few family friends. He promised it would only be 4 or 5 extra people. I compromised for the sake of peace, though unease gnawed at me. On the morning of the party, Robert seemed distracted, constantly on his phone. By noon, the doorbell rang. Nancy and Walter arrived overdressed, followed by 6 couples carrying wine and expensive gifts. Surprise! Nancy beamed as strangers poured into my home. Robert appeared in a suit, clearly prepared for this, confirming it was no surprise to him. They had brought caterers, floral arrangements, and cases of wine, dismissing my simple decorations and homemade touches as unsuitable. With every minute, my house, my sanctuary, transformed into something unrecognizable, a stage for Nancy and Walter's social climbing. The final blow came when Nancy, speaking to a guest, referred to the house as Robert's new place and casually suggested converting the guest suite into a library, erasing the space I had chosen for my parents. Furious, I confronted Robert, but he brushed me off, insisting these were important people. When I reminded him my parents would arrive soon, panic flashed across his face. He finally admitted Nancy thought it would be better if my parents came another time. Shock froze my chest. I told him firmly I was leaving to pick them up and expected them to be welcomed. When I returned with my parents, the driveway overflowed with luxury cars and a valet blocked us, asking if we were guests at the Cunningham dinner. My mother, dressed in her best, looked at me in confusion, and my father's breathing was already strained from the walk. At the door, no one answered. My key no longer worked. The locks had been changed. I texted and called Robert, but he ignored me. My parents began shivering in the dropping temperature, my father pale, pressing his chest, my mother's lips tinged blue. Desperate, I tried the back patio, only to be told by a server that this was a private event. Nancy appeared through the glass, refusing to let us in, suggesting we take my parents to dinner and return after 11. Rage coursed through me, but seeing my parents suffering was worse. A kind neighbor offered a blanket, but I knew my father needed his medication inside the refrigerator. In desperation, I found a basement window ajar and forced myself through, scraping my arm and injuring my ankle. Inside, the house was unrecognizable. Our furniture shoved aside, replaced by rented pieces, servers carrying trays, a bar in the dining room. I unlocked the front door and brought my freezing parents inside. My father's face was gray, his lips trembling, his breathing shallow. I rushed to retrieve his medication from behind trays of canapes, helping him take it as the room fell silent, guests staring as though we were intruders. Nancy stormed over. Furious, I had interrupted her party, accusing me of causing a scene in front of the governor's assistant. I reminded her this was my house, that she had left my parents in the cold. She dismissed it as miscommunication. Robert appeared, trying to excuse everything, until suddenly my father slumped in pain, gasping that it felt like his last heart attack. I dialed emergency services as Nancy hissed that I was embarrassing them. Walter waved it off, insisting my father was fine. Paramedics arrived, diagnosing hypothermia and cardiac distress, rushing him to the hospital while guests watched in uneasy silence. I rode in the ambulance, holding my mother's trembling hand, shame and fury burning inside me. At midnight, as my father stabilized under observation, Robert called, asking casually when I was coming home. When I told him my father had nearly died, he dismissed it as exaggeration, repeating his mother's claim that my parents sought attention. Something inside me broke. Calmly, I told him not to be there when I returned. When I returned to the house the next day, Nancy and Walter were still there, sitting in my living room as though it belonged to them. Evidence of the party lingered in the form of wine stains and cigarette burns, the debris of strangers' laughter. Robert sat at the kitchen island, haggard but defiant. Nancy greeted me as if I had been away on a vacation instead of at the hospital with my father. I ignored her and asked Robert if he had even called to check on my father's condition. He hadn't. Nancy immediately shifted the conversation back to the party, bragging about connections Robert had made, as though my father's near-death was a trivial inconvenience compared to their networking success. My anger sharpened into cold clarity. When I confronted Robert about the locks, the caterers, the strangers in our home, he admitted he had known but claimed he didn't want to upset me. The betrayal washed over me in waves, and I told him I was packing a bag. Nancy dismissed my reaction as dramatics, insisting every marriage required adjustments, but I no longer cared about her words. At Vanessa's apartment that night, I broke down. Vanessa, who happened to be an attorney, listened in disbelief as I described the ordeal, telling me it wasn't only wrong but potentially illegal. Days later, as my father recovered, I discovered Robert had secretly withdrawn nearly $40,000 from our joint account before the party, most of it spent on catering and event services under his father's name. He had cleared out nearly all our liquid savings. Vanessa helped me contact financial advisors who confirmed that since I had provided 70% of the down payment, I had leverage. Then came the call from Robert's sister, who confessed Nancy and Walter had done the same thing to her, moving in, taking over, manipulating until her marriage nearly collapsed. It was a pattern. The guest suite in my house had not been an idle suggestion. It was a calculated plan. Determined to protect myself and my parents, I hired a locksmith with a police escort to change every lock and code in the house. Inside, I found Nancy's clothes in the guest room, her skincare neatly arranged as though she lived there, and a folder in Robert's office with renovation plans repurposing the guest suite into a library and changing our home office into another guest room for their visitors. Even worse, I discovered a change of address form listing my in-laws as residents. They had been planning this from the start. At my attorney's office, I faced them all with documented evidence, medical reports, bank statements, contractor quotes. When Walter dismissed it as family business, my attorney coolly introduced the phrase elder endangerment, and the effect was immediate. Their carefully cultivated social standing began to crumble under the weight of that word. I demanded the full return of funds, written agreements that no modifications would be made without my consent, that Nancy and Walter never have unsupervised access to the house, and that all medical expenses be paid. Nancy called it extortion, but Robert, shockingly, sided with me, agreeing to every condition. For once, he looked at his parents and saw them clearly. In the days that followed, he returned the money, covered my father's hospital bills, and began counseling. He admitted his parents had controlled every choice in his life, and that he had mistaken obedience for peace. But explanations did not erase what had happened. I stayed at Vanessa's, rebuilding my own life, while deciding whether my marriage could survive such betrayal. Word of what happened spread, and Nancy and Walter's social circle quietly turned its back. Invitations dried up, positions were withdrawn, their names whispered in the context of scandal. Robert's siblings began opening up about their own experiences of manipulation, finally speaking out about the control they had all endured. For Robert, therapy began pulling him away from their grip, but for me, trust could not be so easily restored. Months passed. My father stabilized, my mother managed her pain, and our Sunday dinners resumed, filled with warmth and gratitude. My home was reclaimed piece by piece, the guest suite intact for my parents, the decorations Nancy had imposed removed and replaced with ones reflecting my life. My career flourished, sharpened by the clarity crisis brings. At work, I became a mentor, guiding others on recognizing manipulation and setting boundaries. With Robert, reconciliation was tentative. We established clear boundaries with his parents, their contact supervised and limited. He told me he had never truly stood up to them until now, and perhaps he never would have if not for nearly losing everything. I kept separation papers ready, protecting myself while watching his actions. The most profound lesson I carried forward was that family is not defined by blood or marriage, but by respect, care, and the willingness to honor boundaries. Protecting what matters most is not selfish. It is survival. Crisis had stripped away illusions and shown me the truth. Love without respect is worthless, and trust, once broken, must be earned in painstaking steps. 6 months later, I no longer looked at my life with bitterness, but with wisdom. My parents, my true family, reminded me that I had the strength to fix what had been broken. And I did.